Alright, so in my last video, which was about Pokemon Black and White, go watch if you haven't already, I talked about how much I love the game and a lot of its strengths, along with going over the game's story. But Black and White weren't just the only games to come out of the 5th generation of Pokemon, because 2 years later in 2012, these games will end up getting sequels, being Pokemon Black and White 2. Now these games, sort of like the first ones, are very loved by the community, so much so that people consider these the best Gen 5 games. And honestly, I gotta say, I think I'm in that crowd, which may seem crazy since the first Black and White games were such great games, and up to that point, I considered them the peak of the franchise. But I think Black and White 2 has a few slight edges over the first ones. Anyways, getting into the actual games themselves, they take place 2 years after the first ones, and are pretty similar to them as well. But there's still a lot of changes, and I'll be going over most of them. They pretty much start off the same way the first games did. This time we have 2 different protagonists to pick from, being Nate and Rosa. We also have a different starting town, along with only one new rival this time, being Hugh, who is yet again, in my opinion, another great rival. Definitely not on the level of N, but still a great character nonetheless. And he has an interesting motivation for his goals that I'll get into later. Anyways though, Team Plasma is still the main villain group, though they're really not what they used to be. Most of the former members have now left the organization, and they now have a new leader named Colress. Or well, technically he is second in command, though he is the member that we encountered the most. He's basically the lead researcher for Team Plasma and wants to bring out the full potential in Pokemon. While he does have a high position, he's not the one in control of everything. Getsis is still lurking around in the shadows, and he becomes very important later on in the game. Sort of like my previous video, I'll circle back to the story stuff towards the end, and instead I'm going to focus on my favorite things about these games. A lot of the things that I enjoyed about the previous Black and White games are present in these ones. The graphics are still on point, and I'd say even more so than the first games. Some of the gyms have new designs, like the 3rd gym leader Berg's gym being this giant spiderweb puzzle, or Alyssa's gym, which is now a whole runway show, which I think they look really cool. Speaking of gyms, these games give us 3 new gym leaders, Roxy being the new leader of the 2nd gym, Marlin being the new leader of the 8th gym, and Charon, our former rival in the first games, being the 1st gym leader, which is such a cool concept and adds so much more growth to his character. You also have a bunch of new locations in these games, like Burbank City, which is where the 2nd gym is now located. You also have Pokestar Studios, which is basically the Pokemon equivalent of Hollywood, and Humalao City, which is where the 8th gym is located. Each of these locations have something to offer, and overall just add more to the world building. Oh, and I can't talk about my favorite things from these games without mentioning the music. In my last video, I already talked about how much I love the music from the DS era, especially with the first Black and White games. And when it comes to music, Black and White 2 do not disappoint. While a lot of the tracks featured were from the previous games, they add a few new ones. Some of my favorite of which being Colress's theme and Iris's battle theme, who has actually replaced Alder as the champion. You even have the creepy strange house music, which is honestly one of the most unsettling tracks in the franchise. All of this overall just continuing the streak of great music from this generation. Anyways, there's one more major change that I want to mention, and it's the fact that they expanded the amount of Pokemon that you can catch in the main story. Instead of only being able to use Gen 5 Pokemon like you were in the last Black and White games, you're able to catch Pokemon from different regions. Some people didn't really like the fact that you could only use Gen 5 Pokemon in the previous games. Now personally, to me, it's not much of a big deal, but nonetheless, I think including Pokemon from all regions is a superior option to me. Overall, even with these changes, Black and White 2 stay pretty true to the first games, and they don't take away any of my enjoyment from this generation. Actually, they do quite the opposite. Even the more minor changes I thought were pretty cool, and it made me appreciate the thought that went into these games a lot more. Alright, time to circle back to the story. So sort of like the first games, the big climax doesn't happen until after the 8th gym, though there are a few things that happen before it that I do want to mention, starting with Team Plasma. In the first Black and White games, their main goal was to liberate all Pokemon, but since they've been defeated and most of its members aren't part of the organization now, their main goal has changed. Now they want to freeze over the Unova region by using the legendary Pokemon Kyurem, which is one step in Getsis' plan to take over the region. After you beat the 8th gym in Humalao City, you board the Team Plasma ship with Hugh to take them down. After you go through a bunch of grunts, you eventually encounter Colress and defeat him. You and Hugh also fight against the Shadow Triad, who are key members of Team Plasma. Oh, and I guess now would be a good point to talk about Hugh's motivation and why he hates Team Plasma. A few years before the game takes place, Hugh's younger sister was given a pet Purloin from their grandfather, but at some point the Purloin would get stolen by Team Plasma and wouldn't be seen again. Since then, he's held a grudge against them. Though on the ship we do get the Purloin back, though when we receive it, it's no longer a Purloin and has evolved into a Lipard, but Hugh still takes it anyway, and after the climax he does give it back to his sister. Anyways though, Team Plasma takes Kyurem out of the ship and brings it to the giant chasm, and when we get off the ship and get down there, we see Getsis, who is ready to finish the job in freezing all of Unova. He explains that this is the place where Kyurem's power resonates, and after all of this, he commands Kyurem to attack the player, but before it can hit, this happens. This dude M pulls up on his legendary and guards you from the attack like the badass he is. You know what, honestly, I think at this point he might just be my favorite Pokemon character. Now after this, GOATED uses this thing called the DNA Splicer on Kyurem, which will cause either Reshiram or Zekrom to fuse with it. I guess here I should also explain the lore between Kyurem, Reshiram, and Zekrom. So pretty much Reshiram and Zekrom used to be one Pokemon, with Reshiram being one half and Zekrom being the other, and they also share two trainers who were two brothers. But at some point the two brothers would get into a dispute, and this would cause both sides of the dragon to separate from each other, creating both Reshiram and Zekrom. However, apparently after this, Kyurem would be created from the leftovers of the separation. Anyways though, back to the current game, you fight against either Black or White Kyurem depending on which version you're playing. And after you win, in a fit of rage, GOATED challenges you to a battle, even using a few Pokemon that he had a part of his team from the previous games. Once you defeat him, he disappears and N leaves you with a message, encouraging you to continue on to the Pokemon League. But I think the most important thing from this message is that N still remembers the lessons he learned from the last game, that Pokemon and trainers can help and have strong bonds with each other. And after this, he flies out of the chasm. Oh, and mind you that all this happens while Unwavering Emotions, or Unwavering Heart, whichever one you want to call it, is playing in the background, which really just adds a whole lot more emotion to this scene. This generation really just keeps getting better and better, bruh. So of course after this, you go through Victory Road and make it to the Pokemon League. Then you challenge the Elite Four, who are all still the same, and also that OST still slaps. And then you eventually fight Iris. And from here, of course, you know how it goes. You defeat her, become champion, then the credits roll and the game ends here. Is what I would say if the game really ended here. I feel like it would low-key be a disservice not to mention Black and White 2's post-game, because there is so much you can do within it. Now I know in my previous video when I was talking about the first games, I hadn't really talked about the post-game that much. I very briefly mentioned White Forest and Black City, but that's really about it. I didn't even get into the fact that you could still challenge Alder and even catch Kyurem. Overall, the Black and White post-game was pretty solid, but the sequels took things to a completely different level. Black and White 2 has one of, if not the biggest post-game in the franchise. You know what, I'm gonna just speed through some of the things that you can do real quick. There's a whole side quest where you can go back to Dragon Spearow Tower and catch either Reshiram or Zekrom. You can visit Nacrene and Straighten City, which were the original locations of the first and second gyms. You can battle against the former champion Alder, as well as his grandson, which you can do in White Forest or Black City. These two places have also gotten upgrades since the first games. Oh, and speaking of battles, you can fight N in this game and even spend time with him, as well as going around his old castle. I really like the fact that Game Freak is still adding more to his character, even with him not being a major focus in this game. And all of this content isn't just one post game. But wait, I'm still not done. I haven't even mentioned the numerous legendaries you can catch, the many other side quests you can complete, or the fact that you can finish an entire dating sim, etc, etc. You can kind of start to see why this post game is so worth mentioning. But out of all things to do in this post game, my favorite thing has to be the Pokemon World Tournament. Now technically you can access this before the post game, but each time I play Black and White 2, I've done it after the main game. The Pokemon World Tournament is basically what the name says. Here you're able to battle against trainers from every region introduced up to this point. Whether it be random trainers, gym leaders, or even champions, they're all here. You can even battle Bianca, who hasn't gotten much action since the last games. This is another thing that I think was genuinely ahead of its time. It was such a fire addition, and we haven't really seen anything like this since. Or well, at least not to this magnitude. All of this content really just goes to show how big these games were. And overall, I think it's really just a testament of how good the post games during the DS era were. Looking back at both Black and White and Black and White 2, Black and White experimented with a lot of different and new things that, while being controversial, still aged well in my eyes, and were executed really well. Black and White 2, on the other hand, takes most of the elements from the first games and sort of mixes them with a similar formula of previous Pokemon generations, which I think it succeeds in doing so, and it turns out to be just as, if not even better than the first games. Overall, this generation pushed the boundaries for the DS as a whole. Pokemon Black and White 2, to me, is really what peak Pokemon looks like, and is another reason as to why I think Generation 5 is GOATED. But with all that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and end the video here. If you've made it this far into the video, hope you enjoyed. I know this video was supposed to come out earlier this month, but I ended up getting sick, so I did have to hold off on recording for a little while. But hey, we here nonetheless. So thanks for watching, like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll catch y'all in the next video.